ahead and have a seat. Welcome to Village Church. If this is your first time here, my name's Steve, one of the pastors here at Village Church, and as always, I am thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it to Matthew 26. We'll be starting in verse 1 today. But over the past 2 months, we've been dealing with basically the final sermon that Jesus gave in his earthly ministry called the Olivet Discourse. And in it, over the past 2 months, we've discussed basically God's pronouncement of judgment over sin, first for the sin of Israel in rejecting true worship of God and their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. And of course, this marks the moment of shift where Jesus signifies the presence of God would leave the temple of Israel to go to all of the nations all over the earth. And he then speaks towards the end of Matthew 24, all through Matthew 25, of the future judgment that would fall on the entire world at his second coming. That in the end, you will be judged for your sin. You will be judged for whether or not you've given your life to Jesus Christ as Lord. And then in Matthew 26, where we'll begin today, we kind of begin the march towards the crucifixion of Jesus. And the rest of the gospel, according to Matthew, contains both the climax and the great conclusion of this gospel. And we see the events that are going to surround the arrest, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus, and culminating the mission of redemption that Jesus was sent on by the Father. And so for the next few days in the life of Jesus, this is going to serve basically as the entire foundation for the Christian faith. Jesus being on a mission to substitute his life for sinful men and then rise again from the dead to win victory over sin and death. And so as we go through 26, 27, and 28 of Matthew, understand that these are the most important events in the history of the world. And that salvation itself depends on the mission of Jesus, where God has determined that this was how he would receive ultimate glory from the world that he created. And it's faith and faith alone in Jesus Christ that will save you from your sin, that will bring salvation into your life. And so I want to begin reading as it goes into kind of a narrative of a few different events. And so we're going to look at 3 events that are very closely happening together, but they're actually a few days apart. And Matthew's point is to show us the different ways in which Jesus was valued. And I want to start reading in verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." Now, when Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, which, man, that'd be the worst nickname, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me, for you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. So in this text, you have 3 different scenes offered by Matthew, the writer of this text. And the first scene is the plotting, the strategy that's going on with the high priest and the chief priests of the temple, the elders of the people, who are gathering to say, what can we do about this Jesus who has just condemned the temple? And then the next scene is a dinner party where Simon the leper has hosted, And we see that an alabaster flask of ointment is poured onto Jesus' head to anoint him for burial. And then the very next scene is the scene in which Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver. And so I want to point out, as normal, 3 things from this text that you need to apply to your life. And the first one is that the death of Jesus was the plan of God. The death of Jesus was the plan of God. It's fascinating that Jesus looks to his disciples and he says that in 2 days I'm going to be killed. And then the chief priests and the elders in their strategy session, they say, well, we're not going to do it during the feast. And immediately you see the people that are ultimately going to be responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. They're planning something according to their timetable, but Jesus has already contradicted it. And Jesus, of course, was right. Jesus wanted it to take place in Passover, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. But God was in absolute control over this, as he's in absolute control over every aspect of his plan. In these first 16 verses, a lot of ground is covered, and Matthew's emphasis is specific in showing the different ways that people valued the person and work of Jesus Christ in their lives. He focuses in on the strategy session, and importantly, there is a preface to the narrative where Jesus prophesies his own death before anybody else is actually talking about his death. This is the sovereign work of God on display for all of us to see, and really what it's there for is for us to kind of marvel at the control that Jesus had over his life. Especially when you take into consideration the most devious plan of completely wicked men that in Matthew 24 were rebuked by Jesus. Throughout the entire Gospel of Matthew, he's had this emphasis on showing Jesus' antagonistic relationship with the religious rulers of Israel. But every aspect of what they're trying to do to silence Jesus only goes further and further into the sovereign work of God. There's nothing that humanity can do to hinder the work of God even for a moment. Because the moment that we think that we are stopping God from doing something, we're just further going into the plan of God more and more. Think about the life of Jonah the prophet. In trying to run away from God, he ends up actually giving a prophecy that Jesus uses to describe his time in the tomb. In 3 days, Jonah was in the belly of the fish. In 3 days, the Son of Man was in the tomb. Jonah thought he was rebelling against God, and he was. But God says, even in your rebellion, I will use it for my plan. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, after the tumultuous life of Joseph, he looks to his brothers and he says, what you meant for evil, God has meant for good. And that promise serves as a beacon for our lives, that even when we endure the worst rejection that this world can give us, even when we're enduring persecution or suffering at the hands of other men, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you know that what man means for evil, God will ultimately use for good. So regardless of what you do in your life, you ultimately have 2 choices. The sovereign plan of God can either work out to your benefit or to your detriment. And if you rebel against God, that does not stop God from using your life. He'll use it however he wants to. That's literally what it means to be God. But it will be to your detriment and to your pain if you do not submit your life to faith in Jesus Christ. But if you will submit your life to faith in Jesus Christ, every aspect of the sovereign plan of God will be for your good. And it does not get much more wicked than the high priest Caiaphas. He was a con man. He had turned the righteous worship of God into a money-making operation for his own wealth and for his own power. And now he's gathered with the other priests, and they are plotting to kill Jesus. But Jesus has already said to his disciples, the Son of Man must go, and he must suffer, and he must die. And this is something that Jesus has said a few times throughout the book of Matthew. In Matthew 16:21, Jesus had said, or the narrative had gone, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples what? That he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, scribes, be killed, and on the 3rd day raised. So you get this picture that Jesus knows what the conclusion is. He was very much born for this reason. Jesus was born to die. In John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, Jesus again is quoted stating that this was the plan of the Father, and only Jesus has the authority to lay his own life down. He says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This charge I received from my Father. You overestimate the authority that you have. Every one of us do it. We think we have some semblance of control. You don't. Only God does. God is in absolute control. Jesus was in absolute control. Those that would deny him can't stop him. Those that would try to kill him, they can't do it unless he says, "Okay, I give you permission." No human can kill Jesus unless Jesus himself allows it. You see two things in this text. First, you see the deity of Jesus as he is in absolute control of what happens to him. No human can claim that. You don't know when your time on this earth is over. I don't know when my time on this earth is over. Only God knows that. So only Jesus Christ could say with absolute authority, "I have to give you permission. I have to lay my life down. No one can take it." Only God can say that. So Jesus wasn't just a great teacher. He wasn't just some sage with wisdom that was above most people's wisdom. He wasn't some nirvanic figure. Rather, Jesus is God. But there's a second thing, and that is the sovereign plan of God. Jesus points out that the Father had given him this mission. Therefore, Jesus was born for the purpose of laying his life down as a sacrifice. Jesus is pointing us towards that conclusion, towards that reality. Not only is God in control of his plan, but I want you to understand that from this text we see that God is in control of salvation. Verses 3 through 5 briefly cover the strategy session of the chief priests and elders plotting to kill Jesus without disturbing the peace of the population. The reason that they would do this is so that Rome wouldn't have to deal with an uprising, because the greatest fear that the chief priest and the high priest had was that Rome would come in and completely take over, because at that time Rome had saw fit to allow the chief priests and the high priest to basically run Jerusalem so long as they could keep it peaceful. John chapter 11 verses 47 through 53 show even more the devious nature of Caiaphas leading this evil strategy session. John covers it with a little more detail when he writes, "So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered, and the council said, 'What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come to take away both our place and our nation.'" And I love what John does here, because Matthew's emphasis is to show the kingly authority of Christ. John's emphasis is more on showing the deity of Jesus Christ. These men point out, they say, "This man does many signs. And if we let him keep performing these miracles and showing that he is God, everyone's just going to believe that he is who he says he is." And from that, you can really see that you could have all the evidence of the world right in front of your feet and still reject Jesus as king if your heart is stony. Some of you have people in your lives who won't believe no matter what you tell them, who won't believe no matter how much evidence there is in this world that Jesus is God. They just simply refuse to believe, and you're wondering, is it you? Is it because you're doing something wrong? And I'll tell you, no, it's the sin in their lives. So long as you are married to your sin, even if Christ himself comes from heaven, becomes a human being, is born of a virgin, lives a perfect life, performs miracle after miracle in front of you, you see from this text, sinners will still reject him. Friends, the only thing that brings faith is repentance of sin. You have to love Jesus more than you love your sin. And so we see from this text, they knew the entire Old Testament. They knew the Old Testament better than you do. They probably maybe even knew it better than I do, but I don't know if I'd admit that. But still, they reject Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Verse 49 of John 11. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad, so from that day on they made plans to put him to death. And I love what Caiaphas does here. He shows his wickedness, but the sovereignty of God working in his life. It's this strange juxtaposition that Caiaphas had. Because he starts out and he's like, "You know nothing. You're talking about Jesus." And you think, well, he's the high priest. Maybe he'll get it. Maybe he's going to rebuke everybody. No, he says something even more wicked. He says it's better that we kill Jesus than that we lose our entire kingdom. We got to keep our power. We got to keep our control. We got to protect Israel from Rome. Not because they loved Israel so much, but because they loved their place in Israel. But note what the text says. This very wicked thing that Caiaphas said, God made him say it. He said it because he was high priest that year, and God put a prophecy through his mouth. It's better for one man to die than a whole nation be condemned. And what is Caiaphas doing? Even in his rejection of the gospel, God makes him proclaim the gospel. You cannot stop the gospel from triumphing over the sin of this world, and Caiaphas is evidence of that. Even in his condemnation, God draws out praise. Verses 50 to 51 show the sovereignty of God in a way that oftentimes we miss it because we pass so over it. Evil can never defeat God. The patterns of this world will never defeat God. The most unrighteous of schemes against the people of God, against God himself, will not stop him even for a moment. Friend, if you're in here and you've rejected the gospel, understand your rejection of the gospel does nothing to stop God from using you to further his plans. Wouldn't it be better if you just got to enjoy it rather than you're condemned by it? God will use whoever he wants in order to accomplish his purposes. He's been doing that for thousands of years. Caiaphas, this great high priest who should have known better, didn't know better. God still uses him. So friend, I say that so that you'll understand, when you get discouraged about living for the purposes of God in a very wicked world, be encouraged because God always wins. God will make the evil people of this world either one, repent of their sins and trust in Jesus Christ, or two, look like absolute fools when they're condemned in hell forever. But I'll tell you one thing is for certain. God's will is always going to be done regardless of who is trying to stand in the way. So whether it's a family member, whether it's a politician, whether it's some kind of authority figure in your life, do not pay them any mind. Obey God and carry on. Number two this morning, following Jesus will cost you the praise of the world. It will. People are not going to line up and applaud you because of your faithfulness to Jesus Christ. And this text shows us that a couple of different ways. First, we just looked at one. The religious rulers of that day, they gathered together not to praise Jesus, but to kill Jesus. But then secondly, note the party, the house of Simon the leper. Now, why was he named Simon the leper? We don't really know. Text doesn't tell us. I can only assume that he at one time had leprosy and was healed. But still, I would really want a different nickname. Sounds like the nickname I'd give someone, and you don't want me to give you a nickname, all right? But Simon the leper in Bethany welcomes him. Now, this was a few days before the Olivet Discourse. The book of John gives us some more specificity. Matthew's not going for chronology. Matthew puts it where he does more for the effect, and putting it between two rejections of Jesus, he gives it a treasuring of Jesus. And so right after the resurrection of Lazarus, we see that the book of John tells us that they gathered at the house of Simon the leper. And the sister of Lazarus, Mary, is the one that's anointing the head of Jesus, preparing him for his burial. And note that the disciples Chiefly, it's Judas. We know that from the book of John. But the disciples begin to murmur among themselves, the gospel according to Mark tells us, to question whether or not she should be doing what it is that she's doing. And you see, she's giving Jesus the most valuable thing probably that she owns. Because we're seeing from the text of this alabaster jar. In that day, an alabaster jar of this type of perfume would be worth about a year's worth of wages. Somewhere between 100 and 300 denarii is the actual value of these alabaster flasks. And so in someone in her situation, this would probably have been the most expensive thing that she owned. And in this scene, she's anointing Jesus after the resurrection of her brother as a prophecy preparing Jesus for his burial. And we know that it's probably because in the book of Luke, it actually tells us that Mary would sit often at the feet of Jesus, soaking in his teachings. And she understood something, obviously, that even the disciples were missing. John chapter 12, verses 4 through 5 reveals to us the source of the complaint when it says, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, and I love that John does this. He throws some shade. He says, he who was about to betray him. And he said, I don't want you to miss who this sucker is. He's the bad guy of the story. Judas said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? That's one of the original virtue signals. Judas, who's not a believer, who doesn't trust Jesus, who doesn't love Jesus, he rejects Jesus, and he says, wouldn't it be better if you sold all of this stuff and gave it to the poor? Then maybe you'd be a true worshiper. He's trying to Jesus juke her. He's trying to virtue signal to the crowd. He's trying to show his righteousness above everybody else's. But Jesus looks, and I love the words that Jesus uses here. Look back in Matthew 26 and verse 10. But Jesus, aware of this, said, why do you trouble this woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Judas is this interesting figure. We don't know a lot about Judas from a first-person perspective. We don't know a lot about his motivations. But the next verse in John 12, verse 6 actually informs us that Judas was a thief. And so you notice people will say the right thing, but they will say it from a bad motivation. People will virtue signal to you while deep inside they're self-righteous criminals. I mean, we've seen that over the last few years. He looks to her and he's stealing out of the money bag of Jesus because that was his job. And he says, couldn't we have sold this? Basically what Judas is really saying is, couldn't we have sold this and I would have pocketed some of that money? His last name, Iscariot, is very interesting. In Latin, it actually means dagger man or insurrectionist. And so he may have been angry that Jesus was foretelling his death rather than leading an insurrection against Rome. We don't know. But we know from the events ahead that Judas was a deeply, deeply wicked man. Mary, though, what do we know about her? All that we know is that she loved Jesus Christ. Her affection was for Jesus. She serves as an interesting picture in the middle of these two rejections of Jesus, the priest's rejection, Judas's rejection. Matthew records this moment importantly to show what it looks like to worship and have a life devoted to Jesus, and that's what her life was marked by. This isn't the first time somebody rebuked Mary because of her love for Jesus Christ. Her sister did it. In Luke 10:38 through 42, it records, now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell them to help me. I love the way people's virtue signals will seem so righteous. Jesus, I'm just doing so much for you. Can't you tell this girl who's just sitting there to help me? Jesus always sees through the heart. Martha, Martha. Says her name twice for effect. You know you're in trouble when Jesus is like, Martha, Martha. In other words, you dummy. You are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Oof. It's one of those soft rebukes that goes to the heart like a dagger. Again, Jesus defended Mary's worship. Friend, when you choose to follow Jesus and your affections lead you to devotion to Him above everything else, you will not receive praise from the world around you. Oftentimes you will receive accusations. People may call you an extremist. People may tell you to balance your worship with devotion to the schemes of this world in order to have some backup plan if the Jesus thing doesn't work out. But those who even claim to be followers of Jesus will often seek to quiet you when you stand against the tide of a wicked culture and giving your absolute everything to Jesus, because you need to preserve your worldly reputation above all. But understand, God never called you to be fully understood or appreciated by the world around you. Mary doesn't offer an explanation. She doesn't defend herself. She simply gives her all to Jesus Christ. And that is the call on every follower of Jesus. Just like Mary and her devotion to Jesus, that is what it looks like to follow Him. Let the world ridicule you for your commitment to Jesus. Let those around you question the sensical nature of the investments that you are making in the life that God has called you to. Let the world ridicule you. Faith always triumphs over compromise every single time. Faith triumphs over wickedness every single time. Don't signal your virtue, just follow Jesus Christ. I see so many now, I'll tell you, I get a front row seat to virtue signaling a lot. I get to hear it firsthand. People like to tell me how great they are. People like to inform me of how much they're doing for the Lord or have done for the Lord. Friends, that's great. I don't mind hearing your resume. I'm proud of you too. But here's the deal. Just follow Jesus and ignore the crowd. If you're living your life for the applause of everyone around you, if you're living your life for the applause of a pastor, if you're living the life for the applause of your family, if you're living your life for the applause of those in your career, if you're living your life wanting people to notice you, one thing's for certain, you will be disappointed. You will be. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, here's the thing, the praise of man is so often followed by the rejection of them all. But I can tell you, Scripture's clear on one thing. Jesus said, if they persecuted me, don't you know they're going to persecute you? In this life, you will suffer tribulation. They crucified our Savior to a cross, and you want them to clap for you? It's not going to happen. That's not the plight of the follower of Jesus Christ. He tells us, take up your cross. I don't know if you know this or not, but that's not the kind of fame most people want. Friend, if you follow Jesus Christ, you will treasure Him more than your own virtue. The complaint of Judas and the crowd he won over, because Matthew kind of gives us the sense that he won a few people to his cause. Because it seems to make sense, doesn't it? Seems to make sense for this complaint. I mean, this thing could have been sold for 300 denarii. That's so much money in that culture. And he's saying, but that could have been given to the poor. Like, we could have done so much with that money. Verse 11 of Matthew 26 states, from Jesus, you're always going to have the poor with you, but Jesus takes precedence above that. I mean, I don't know, that's not the social justice warrior's favorite verse. The poor will always be with you. Doesn't that seem kind of cold of Jesus to say something like that? He's actually quoting the book of Deuteronomy. But here's the deal. The Scripture has many places where it tells us, yes, take care of the poor. Yes, give of your life. Help other people. Love your neighbor in real ways. But Jesus is also clear that there are going to be haters in the world that are going to look for the things that you give to Jesus Christ, and they're going to say, shouldn't you have done this other thing? Wouldn't it have made more sense if you had done this? I mean, I hear it all the time. I mean, people talk to me, and I'm a pastor at such and such church. Oh, yeah, church up on Courthouse Road. Well, if you were a real Christian, wouldn't you sell that building and give all the money to the poor? When you sell your property, give all that money to the poor. When you get rid of these speakers, when you get rid of these lights. Oh, I see you're doing some construction. Oh, you want to build another building. Oh, wouldn't it be better if you just sold all of that, didn't take a salary, became homeless yourself? That's real ministry. That's when I know you're an idiot. And you don't know anything about anything when you say stuff like that. We should always help the poor, and we do. We help people all of the time. Those are wonderful examples of faith in action, but they do not replace the call to use our resources to further the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. She chose the better path. She chose the path of worship. All that she knew was, I want to give the most precious thing in my life to Jesus Christ. I've spent my entire life people questioning my decisions. Because I've known one thing, and I got in this really young. I got in this when I was 19 years old. I mean, 19 years old, do you think people weren't questioning why I was spending so much time at church? I mean, I'll be honest, when I was 12, people were questioning why I was spending so much time at church. I think when I was like 6, people are like, why are you trying to get so many people to go to church? I'll tell you why. Because I love Jesus. And that's all that has ever mattered. I have not one single time tried to defend that to anybody. Not a single time. And I've seen over the course of my life hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people come to faith in Jesus Christ and be discipled. Why? Because I love Jesus and I want to give him the all of my life, and it's been a call for my entire life. And people have always said, what's your backup plan? You call me a fool if you want to, but I've never had one. I've never had a single backup plan. I'll tell you what my backup plan is. When I can't make that disciple, I'm going to go make that one. That's my backup plan. Disciples, making disciples, building the church, growing the church, planting more churches. I want to give in an allegorical way every alabaster flask of ointment of my life to Jesus Christ. And if you think I'm a fool, good luck with that. I don't care. I love Jesus more than I love my reputation. And I've been called a fool so many times in my life, but I am the happiest fool you will ever meet because Jesus is walking every step of the way with me. Mary wasn't worried about her reputation. Why are you? Why do you care so much what people think? They are not God. I read the scriptures and I see what the Lord thinks and I say, that's all that matters. The world can reject me. I win because Jesus wins every single time, and the gospel will triumph over everything in this world. She understood. This is why Mary, you don't know much about Mary, but you know one thing about Mary. She wanted to give everything to Jesus. She understood the most important thing that you will ever understand in your life, if you will ever get it. Jesus was worth more than she had to offer. So she said, I'll just give him it all. I'll just give him it all. And the world around her, even those closest to Jesus, just they turn their noses up at it. Prepare yourself. That's what's going to happen. If you give everything, if you go all in on the gospel, people are going to turn their nose up at you. Who cares? I'm going to heaven. Number 3, Jesus was betrayed as a slave for the sin of others. I mean, we get such polar portraits in this narrative. Jesus immediately after the complaint of Judas, gospel according to Matthew, and I love that Matthew kind of retracts names. It's like one of those classified government documents where things are blacked out a little bit. Doesn't mention Judas by name, doesn't mention Mary by name. Why? Because I think Matthew just wanted you focusing on Jesus. Matthew just wanted you to see the amazing picture so that you could apply the narrative to your life. And he then immediately goes to the story of Judas in verse 14. It says, one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest. And it's almost like he uses a story from Bethany, happened a few days earlier. He says that was the breaking point. That was where Judas knew Jesus wasn't going to get him rich. That's where Judas knew this thing has an expiration date on it, so I better look out for number one. I better get on the right side of history, is what Judas was saying. About 3 days after the death of Jesus, he regretted that. Oh, I don't know if fast forward to the end of the story. He did. He went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. What's Jesus worth to you? We go back to the beginning of the text. Jesus says in 2 days during the feast, I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be killed. It's an important theological note is that the chief priests did not want to arrest him during Passover. Why? Because the priests wanted to avoid doing it while Jerusalem was filled with people making sacrifices. During Passover, at that point in history, somewhere around 260,000 lambs would be sacrificed in less than a week. All right? And so this is a big feast. This is a big festival. This was the biggest one that they would have for the year. So it would make sense through the eyes of the chief priests to make the arrest and crucifixion happen afterwards so that it would be a little quieter, so there wouldn't be so many people around. But God likes to get noticed. So Jesus says in 2 days, he makes a spectacle so that Rome would notice. Jesus knew when it would take place. Why? Because Jesus wanted it to be connected to the Passover so that you would see the Passover was about Jesus. You would see that Jesus was the ultimate Passover lamb. This is why the temple was obsolete. But it also reveals the plans of man flowing directly into the sovereign rule of God. Judas would offer to the captors when it would be most convenient for him. And when was that? We know that it's while Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the middle of the night. Judas basically looks at him and he says, this is the only opportunity you're going to get. This is the only time he's ever going to be alone. Go get him right now. So they seize on it. But don't miss the fact that the perfect Passover lamb was sold for the wage of a slave. Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. That figure has become known in our day as the wage of a traitor. But it's actually a fulfillment of Zechariah 11, 12 through 13. So it was annulled on that day as the sheep traders who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. Then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages. But if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Now Zechariah 11 is about the rejected shepherd of Israel who saves the people, but he's still rejected by the people. And his wage is 30 pieces of silver. And after this text, God tells the rejected shepherd, throw this to the potter in the house of God. It's a direct prophecy of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. But what many people miss about 30 pieces of silver is that it goes back to Exodus 21:32. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master at 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Compare this amount, which is less than half of what the bottle of alabaster flasked ointment was worth. You have two stories showing the worth of Jesus Christ. You have two narratives comparing what Jesus was worth to them. To one, Jesus was worth more than what was potentially the most valuable thing she owned. To the other, Jesus was sold for far less. And when you consider what you are giving your life to gain in this world, you see the parallel of the worth of Jesus Christ to you. Then you consider the price that Jesus Christ was willing to pay. The worth of Jesus Christ should be measured by his sacrifice. He gave his all. He gave his life. Jesus lowered himself into the deepest depths of suffering for you and for me. The one who had never known sin became the sacrificial lamb, taking the guilt of all of my sin and your sin onto his shoulders. Jesus had only known the favor of the Father, yet Jesus was willing to take the full wrath of the Father onto himself. He substituted himself for you and for me. See, Mary sat listening to the teachings of Jesus, and she understood what Jesus was going to do. And so what did she do? She honored him. She gave of herself to Jesus Christ to show the real treasure of her life was him. Makes me think of what my response to the worth of Jesus Christ is. How do the investments that you are making in your life reveal the value that you place on the Son of God? How much would it take for me to sell out my faith to the things of this world just like Judas did? Or am I like the high priest that values Jesus more dead so that he won't stand in my way of the vision for myself? Or am I going to be like Mary, who sees Jesus as the gift of greatest value that she could ever spend her life pursuing in worship? She chose the better path. And I'll tell you this, only your life reveals the worth of Jesus to you. So live wisely. A few application points this morning. First, God's plans are always victorious. I don't struggle with doubt like some do, because I know Jesus wins. The resurrection shows Jesus wins. Life will always prove that Jesus Christ is Lord of all. Secondly, value faithfulness to Jesus over the applause of the world. If you truly follow Jesus, people will always be questioning you. Very seldom will you receive the applause of man for it. Thirdly, God's timing is always perfect. Chief priests didn't want to do it during the Passover, but Jesus said, I do. So they did. Fourthly, Jesus fully paid the cost of sin. Fully. Paid in full. Fifthly, take the posture of Mary rather than Judas. Take the posture of Mary rather than Judas. Worship Jesus Christ more than you criticize followers of Jesus Christ. Worship Jesus Christ over looking out for what's best for you. Worship Jesus Christ over absolute everything because he is Lord of all.